Good photographic technique is made up from a number of different skills, and that does include post-processing. The trouble with these skills is they all fit together like a complex jigsaw. So it's very easy for us to lose a piece of that jigsaw. My name's Beckham. In a recent video, I suggested that at times we can sometimes be slightly overwhelmed by the technical side of our photography. We concentrate so much on the many different skills needed to capture a better than average image that one vital aspect is missed. Now, I've heard of you amongst some amateur photographers, especially when something has gone wrong, that there's a setting they believe they're missing. And if they knew what that setting on their camera was, that would fix all their technical issues. The truth is, it's not always quite as simple as that, and at times we need to pull together a number of skills and experiences to improve our success rate. With these three thumbnails, we can demonstrate what we're up against, and while this scenario is going to be familiar to many photographers, maybe not to all. All of these three images were shot with a 400mm lens with an ISO of 1600. The author is very close to the subject with this 400mm lens. Now, the benefits of this are a really good frame filling shot, but with a very limited depth of field. The images were also handheld, so the potential for camera shake makes what the author was up against a lot more difficult. Now, the old shutter speed guidelines for hand holding a 400mm lens used to be to make sure you use a minimum of a 400th of a second shutter. The lens used here is image stabilized, so we may expect a two-stop advantage. If we were to shoot at a 60th of a second with image stabilization, that would be the equivalent of around 250th of a second. Still not quite the old guideline of 400ths of a second, but we're close. Now, I know that to capture these shots, the photographer was resting on a solid surface, so perhaps the playing field isn't so wildly tilted against them. If we lean against something solid and we brace ourselves on our elbows, the lens is almost cradled in our hands. We're not holding it as we do when we just stand and hold the weight of the lens and the camera. So we become a very stable tripod. Then if we add those two stops gained by the image stabilization, we have a much more level playing field. But we still need a little more. We're focusing so close to the subject in the second image in that batch of three that we need the bird to be completely side on to the camera to maximize the depth of field. As we can see here, the eye is pretty much sharp, but the bird's just moved its head very slightly away from us to its left, and that's moved the beak and most of the front of the face out of the plane of focus. Now, these first two thumbnails certainly shows us how critical focus and depth of field are, particularly more so when we're using a long telephoto lens. In addition to that, we're very close to our subject. In the third shot of these three thumbnails, we can see we appear to have a pretty sharp shot. If we look at the technical details, we can see we were shooting at a 60th of a second, and I was discussing the merits of that earlier on. But you can also see the author here used a smaller aperture of f11 that seems to have done a pretty good job. The eye and the beak look critically sharp, and as an advantage it's quite nice to have the bird's head looking downwards. That diagonal shape gives more appeal to the picture. Now, as we'll see when we open this up into Camera Raw in a few moments, we've lost the composition on the third of the thumbnails where the image appears to be sharp. Now, the solution may have been to back off just a little bit. rather than use that 400mm lens at its longest setting, if we'd have zoomed back to 350 or maybe 300mm, we would have had a lot more space to be able to compose the shot better. We would have increased the depth of field a little bit too, and limited any camera shake. Now, I'm not sure we've got any on that shot, but of course we wouldn't have known that at the moment we pressed the shutter button. So with the image opened up into Adobe Camera Raw, and I've selected the crop tool from the top right, we get to see the image with the rule of thirds grid, and we can see how the composition is way off. It's quite nice that the beak is coming down at an angle and it's crossing that bottom line, but the bird really is in the wrong place within the frame. We're a little bit too close. Now, we either have to live with the composition we have, or we could make our raw adjustments and use Photoshop skills to perhaps improve matters. I'd like to take this image quickly through Adobe Camera Raw because most of the work's going to be done in Photoshop to correct the composition. One thing worth mentioning here, because we shot this image at 1600 ISO, we need to be on the lookout for noise, but we're fortunate that the background is quite dark here. So the first thing we may think about doing, especially as we look at the bird's eye and the little bit of feather detail around the eye, we may think about going to the Basic tab, and we may think about pushing up the shadows, which gives us an immediate improvement in the bird. But if I was to zoom in on the background, we then can see quite a bit of the noise. We always see noise more in even tones like backgrounds rather than the feather detail. So we perhaps would want to do a little bit of work with noise reduction here, but perhaps there's another way. I'm going to hit Control 0 because what I'm going to suggest is we just flip things on its head really. We don't need to lighten the shadows in the entire bird. And what we do need to change, maybe the better way to do that is using the adjustment brush. So if I double click the shadow detail and reset it, what I could do here is to actually take down the blacks a little more. I could darken the background a bit more so that there's no hint of any noise. But that does mean I've got to brighten the bird in a couple of areas. Well, if we select that adjustment brush, I'd need to click somewhere to create the pin. I'm going to have a look at the settings here. The shadows are already been pushed way up. The exposure's up a little bit. I think I'm reasonably happy with that. I'll pick a little bit of saturation as well, not a great deal. But now I can start to brush over this area. Looking at my flow over on the right hand side, it's a little bit on the heavy side. So I'm going to drag that down. I'm just going to brush over the areas. Remember, we would usually zoom in quite a bit here. I'm going to try to do this while it's fully on screen. Maybe I'll have to do a little bit for the beak. Make my brush a little smaller, but I can start to bring a little more through here just to give a little more sparkle. So what we've managed to do is to raise the tones in the Kookaburra where we want them raised, but we don't seem to have enhanced that noise in any way, which is a good thing. I'm going to go up to the top right of the screen and go back to the General or the Basic tab, as in our case here. I'm just going to have a final last look at a little bit of vibrance. A little bit of clarity, not much. But now I'm going to open this up into Photoshop. With the image opened up into Photoshop and the crop tool selected, we're in a very similar position to one that I showed in my previous video. Here though, we seem to have a route out of that problem. I'm going to start by dragging the corner of my crop here You'll notice if you look up at the top left, I'm retaining the 3:2 aspect ratio, just for a moment at least. So if we drag this out, we can then move the image around. That would have been the ideal position for the eye on that rule of thirds cross of the vertical and horizontal. I don't want to cut off quite as much of the back of the animal, so maybe we'll steal a little bit and we'll come down just a little bit. Remember, the rule of thirds doesn't have to be absolutely perfect, but certainly we're improving matters here. We could, I suppose, also consider a slight rotation, because if we wanted to tilt that beak down so that the tip of the beak comes closer to the crosshairs on the left-hand side, then we could move the cursor outside of the crop and we could start to do a little bit of rotation and see if we were happy with that. We're all going to choose something a little different, I guess. I think perhaps I've got a little bit too much at the bottom because we're going to be using content aware fill to fill in the gaps, and maybe I'm asking quite a lot down the bottom, so I'm going to bring this back a little bit. It doesn't make a great deal of difference with the eye. We're still very close there. Let's move that up a little bit. But what I'm going to do here is hit the tick on the options bar and suggest that perhaps that was what we should have framed up in the first place. So we're going to attempt to fill in all of the blank areas here with content aware fill. We may be asking rather a lot. The only way to see if it's going to do an effective job is to give it a try. I'm going to select my polygonal lasso tool and I'm going to click just inside the image and go right round the outside and down this side too and up to finish off. Now we've got everything selected outside of the Kookaburra. So if I go to Edit and we choose Content Aware Fill, if you look over on the right hand side, you'll notice that I've got the Auto button checked. And in those few seconds you can see that it's done a pretty good job. If you look further down the panel on the right, you'll see that I'm about to output to a new layer. So let's click OK and take a closer look in Photoshop with that selection removed, Control D. I'll hit Control 0 to fit the image on screen. Now I think that repair is remarkably good. I think it needs just a little bit of help from us, but not very much at all. But I think to proceed, I'm going to merge those two layers together from the top right of the layers. We can either merge or flatten at this point. I don't think it makes a great deal of difference. What I'd like to do is to just darken the background a little bit, certainly up on the edges and the top left corner, maybe along the base too. And we have a little bit of a problem. If you look down at the body of the Kookaburra, you can see we've got a little bit of a repeat down there which needs a touch with the healing brush. But let's start by going over to the toolbox and selecting the burn tool. I need a nice big brush, as you can see here. Looking at the range above, you can see we're already set to shadows and the exposure is set to 10%. I'm going to drop that down by hitting the 0.5 key, because I want to do some delicate work here. Just sweep my brush over this area just to darken that a little bit, and down the base too, just to even up that background. It didn't need very much at all. I think that's all I need to do there. A touch of the healing brush should work wonders down at the front of the Kookaburra, so let's select that next from the toolbox and just wipe across one of those little areas which is mimicking the other. We can touch this a couple of times, but that's all we really needed to do. Maybe that one too. There we have a result. Now I may decide to give just a little more colour to the beak of the bird and maybe even around the eye, and to do that I'd go back to the same tools we've just been using, but this time the sponge tool. The option I've got selected just above my cursor is saturate. The flow is set to 10%. I can zoom in, and using that brush I'll adjust the size with the square bracket keys. You can just give a little touch to the saturation of the beak, and maybe a little bit around the eye, because that's where we're hoping that our viewers are going to be attracted to first. Control 0 would fit the image back on screen. Now with the spinning round of the screen you're looking at a slightly different version of the same image. I've done everything exactly the same, but I didn't retain the 3:2 aspect ratio. You'll notice here I've allowed the crop to move into a more oblong shape. It doesn't change things significantly, it's just another option we have. If I take you across to the crop tool and I just click to bring up the crop shape, we can see instantly that now the composition of our kookaburra, whether we are watching or looking at the kookaburra in this image, or in fact in this one, the composition is quite a lot different and improved to the one we started with. Although we've been able to get away with fixing a problem, not quite the point. We need to be on top of these things at the taking stage, because we're not always going to get this lucky. Now, to bring this video to a close, I had a thought just a few moments ago. One of the new tools in Photoshop 2021 is the Edit Replace Sky. And what I've done here is to use that option to put a completely new background behind my kookaburra. Now, believe it or not, this has taken about 3 minutes. I've got a video on that subject of replacement skies, but instead of adding a sky, I added the background you can see. It needed a little bit of softening with some blur, but I hope you'll agree it doesn't work too badly for something which is done in a matter of a couple of minutes. I'll see you next time.